Okay, so welcome to the lecture on Chapter 2 in this World Religions course. This chapter is on indigenous sacred ways. So it's important to define the word indigenous. So the word indigenous means native to a particular place. And it can be a broader term that can refer to not just human beings and cultures and traditions, but also like plants. So, like if you say this plant is indigenous to this region, you're saying that that's where the plant is native from. So when the word indigenous is used in the context for this class, we're referring to people that are native to a particular region and their traditions that we would consider religious traditions, but we'll talk about this later how the concept of religion and culture sort of bleed together in these traditions. Um, so it's important to note, however, that of course, from a scientific understanding, we know human beings or Homo sapiens, our species, evolved in Africa. And then about 40 to 50,000 years ago, some of them left Africa and settled in Europe, and some settled in Asia, and then from Asia to the Pacific Islands, and then the Americas. So you go far enough back in human history. We're all from Africa, but the people that originally settle in different parts of the world are considered to be indigenous to those regions. So sometimes a blanket term that has been used instead of indigenous is native, people that are native to a particular region. You might have heard the people that are native or the original settlers or original humans that settle in Australia referred to as Aborigines. Of course, we have Native Americans or American Indians. It gets kind of complicated referring to people that are native to North and South America because, of course, when Europeans came to the Americas and encountered the Americas, Christopher Columbus thought he was encountering landing in the West Indies, like actually like near India, which is why he referred to the natives that he encountered, who were, native Caribbean people, as Indian. So there's some Native Americans prefer the term Native American. Some sort of still are cool with being referred to as American Indian. But it's kind of outdated and problematic for people who are not Native American to just use the word Indian because that was sort of a misunderstanding and misnomer of these people. And interestingly, there's also people that are obviously native to Africa and Asia as well. And we'll sort of talk about some of the indigenous traditions to those regions. A lot of the indigenous traditions in Asia that we're going to talk about are going to have like their own chapters, some of them, because the line between what is sort of indigenous and what is like a world tradition that gets exported to other regions is kind of tricky. So the next chapter will be on Hinduism, which is, as I mentioned in the last lecture, a catch-all term for all of the indigenous traditions of the subcontinent of India. And we will talk about some Chinese traditions like Taoism and Confucianism as well. Concerning Europeans, so Europeans obviously were not always Christian. Christianity was brought to Europe through the Roman Empire, and often the narrative of indigenous people being conquered by other people with another religion is a violent history, and that's true for Europe too. So some Europeans were forced to become Christian, and so Europeans that are pre-Christian or were not Christianized yet, practiced ancient European indigenous nature-based religions, and they were referred to as pagans or heathens. And we'll talk more about how Christianity demonizes these, historically has demonized these traditions, and associated it with the concept of witchcraft, and even Satan worship and devil worship. And we'll talk about that later. So, another way of thinking about these indigenous traditions is that these are the original instructions. These are the original religious, cultural, philosophical, mythic traditions that originate among people that are native to a particular tradition. And that if you go far back enough in anybody's ancestry, some further back than others, your ancestors come from a particular part of the world and practiced some sort of indigenous tradition to that part of the world. So, in spite of the fact that we're lumping together a lot of these traditions, that in itself is kind of problematic because there is a lot of diversity among the different indigenous traditions that have existed throughout history, and of course, the ones that continue to exist today. Indigenous sacred ways and indigenous culture and religion is not monolithic, and there is a lot of diversity. And it's kind of sad that we only have time to sort of clump a lot of them together in this chapter, and try to get as much information as we can in them. But that's sort of the tragedy of a world religions course, is that we're only going to scratch the surface on a lot of different traditions. So something to keep in mind is sort of the problematic nature of just like trying to explain these vast culturally different traditions in one slide. Not one slide, but one lecture in one chapter. Today, about 4% of the world's population is considered indigenous, but that kind of all gets messy because that's not including people in India that practice Hinduism and exclusively Hinduism, and people that practice both indigenous traditions syncretized or blended with major world religions like Buddhism or Christianity, Islam, what have you. But 4% of the world's population may not sound like a lot. It's a low percentage, but given that there are billions of people on the planet, it's hundreds of millions of people. It's a substantial population. So it's something to keep in mind. And what's sort of problematic about talking through this chapter that was addressed in the textbook is people often talk of indigenous traditions and native traditions as if they're extinct. And it's very important to know that these traditions still continue to exist today, and that there's problematic political consequences for not acknowledging that. And we'll get into some of that later. So, despite the variety among these different traditions, there are some patterns that can be identified, general patterns. And of course, there are some exceptions to any patterns that we're going to identify. So, some of these major similarities among these traditions include that their spiritual beliefs, rituals, and social practices are centered on their own ancestors. So, these traditions often are centered on their understanding of personhood as an individual and as a community, rooted in the history of their ancestors and their people. Another pattern is that they often relate to a specific geographic place, that the land and the natural environment that they are living in and that they are native to is sacred and part of sort of the sacred fabric of their tradition and their culture. And also, a huge thing is that these tend to be nature-based traditions. These are nature-based traditions. The traditions are centered on nature and natural cycles. These are traditions that are seeking to help human communities and cultures live in harmony with their natural environment. It's for survival and thriving within the context of a natural environment. So, understanding Indigenous sacred ways, something to know is that, again, a lot of what is known by sort of the globalized human civilization about these traditions is problematic because what these traditions became sort of known to the world through mostly Western Christian anthropologists. Um, so, as Western Christian anthropologists or Christian missionaries seeking to Christianize indigenous people all over the world in ways that were assuming the superiority of Christianity and the inferiority of Native peoples and their cultures, is it's a problematic setup. So a lot of what we know about some indigenous traditions that no longer exist, and even ones that exist today, is limited because the indigenous people are, and rightfully so, not trusting and not wanting to be very forthcoming about a lot of their traditions and have a lot of secret practices because the people trying to learn about their tradition are outsiders. And historically, some of these outsiders have had a violent agenda. There is a very violent, genocidal history of Christian Europeans, for example, Christianizing and dominating people in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, all over the world. So there is some of what we know about some traditions that maybe no longer exist is sort of limited by what was actually accessible to the outsiders that were trying to learn about these traditions, and not always friendly outsiders. Um, uh, Something we talked about in the last lecture that comes up again here is that some of these Christian outsiders, anthropologists in later centuries, but just usually missionaries or even conquerors early on, often didn't even recognize that indigenous people had a so called religion. And part of that was because a lot of indigenous people and cultures and traditions don't have a similar divide between the sacred and the secular or the profane the way Christianity often does and has historically. So there wasn't a moment when the people were doing religion and not doing religion. Going on a hunt, preparing a meal, all of that was imbued with a sacred sensibility for a lot of indigenous peoples and cultures, and that was lost because it wasn't clear when these indigenous people were doing religion or not from the standpoint of Christian anthropologists or missionaries or conquerors. And so that's just one example of many ways that Christian outsiders trying to understand indigenous lifeways has been a limited and problematic enterprise. So instead of really referring to these traditions as religions, many scholars prefer to use the term lifeway. As you'll see, the chapter refers to these traditions as sacred ways. And that's not to mean that they're not, like, they don't have a religion or they lack religion, but just that the way they express spirituality and meaning and the things that religion gets at in the major world religions is has a different approach, is given a different approach in this context. So life way is a better way of describing these traditions, and a life way is a particular approach to all of life. So Robert Wright, in his book The Evolution of God, who I cited in the last lecture with his thoughts about science and religion both challenging each other and helping each other grow, in his book The Evolution of God, he also makes this point that's relevant to this lecture. If you asked hunter-gatherers what their religion is, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. The kinds of beliefs and rituals we label religious are so tightly interwoven into their everyday thought and action that they don't have a word for them. We may label some of their explanations of how the world works supernatural and others naturalistic, but those are our categories, not theirs. So again, this sort of gives you an idea of how there's not really a sharp divide between the natural world and the spirit world, the transcendent and the material, the sacred, the secular. That reality, there's a more holistic approach to reality. And that gives the ideas behind these traditions and the way that they are practiced more of a holistic lifeway approach to all of life. Of course, not all Indigenous people are hunter gatherers and have been hunter gatherers, and we will get to that later. Something else to consider is the fact that a lot of Indigenous cultures rely on oral transmission of knowledge. That means things are not written down. And in cultures where there's not an emphasis on written text and there's an emphasis on oral knowledge, the tradition itself is more dynamic and there's awareness of that. If you live in a culture that is more based on oral transmission or storytelling, verbal storytelling, rather than writing things down, you are aware that the stories change and are dynamic, and those changes are part of perhaps divine inspiration or sacred inspiration, and are not something to necessarily fight against. There's an understanding of the balance of how traditions and narratives and myths change over time that people would have. In some of the major world religions where there are scriptures, when you have a written scripture, it gives maybe the illusion, depending on your perspective, that the tradition that's being captured and the wisdom that's being captured is more static and rigid and not changing, and that not changing and rigidity is given value that maybe isn't questioned. So what's interesting about a lot of these traditions is that they don't have that sort of rigidity and that staticness that comes with written, solid, unchanging text, the way that a lot of major religions have with their written scriptures as a source of authority and a source of certainty for the tradition. So that's important to acknowledge as well. So some of the cultural diversity amongst these traditions, it's problematic to use the word primitive to describe indigenous traditions. This part of the history of, in particular, European Christian conquerors, conquering the world as capitalism rises and develops, and that's not a historical coincidence that colonialism and the rise of capitalism come together. But that part of what fueled colonialism, which is very violent, and by colonialism I mean there's been forms of colonialism all throughout human history, but in this particular context, the colonialism that led to the capitalist, Western influenced global civilization that we have today. And the colonialism that resulted in that is from the last few centuries, European Christian conquerors going to different parts of the world. And part of what they were doing was very violent and disturbing, and to sort of morally justify this, they often created narratives about how the natives are primitive, and often the fact that the natives didn't practice Christianity was the main reason given to justify dominating them, murdering them, often torturing them, and doing a lot of really nasty stuff. So and some of that lingers today in our white supremacist society and history. In history classes in high school, you don't learn much about African history, for example, and a lot of other cultures, outside of a European culture that goes back to the classical Roman Greek Empire kind of stuff. Um, so it's important that although we can acknowledge that a lot of indigenous communities practice ways of life and traditions that are more ancient and are closer to what human beings were practicing all over the world before, in particular, capitalism came about and before a lot of major world religions um, spread throughout regions they didn't originate from. It's problematic to call these traditions primitive. That's part of a racist history of thinking that there's not culture, and that these indigenous traditions and people are inferior or less sophisticated and advanced, based on Western standards of what it means to be advanced, in quotes. So some indigenous communities and cultures historically had a nomadic survival strategy. So that would mean hunter-gatherer societies. Some were agrarian, meaning that they did have an agricultural based lifestyle and communal structure. And when they are agriculturally based, that's when you see surplus in food, and communities stay settled in a particular region and are not nomadic. And when that happens, you have chiefdoms, and some even larger political states. So there's a lot of variety here. And some of the variety among these societies and cultures is that some are egalitarian, meaning that there isn't everybody's sort of equal in the society in a general sense, and some are hierarchical, meaning that there are power structures and authority figures and people who must submit, in sort of class-based hierarchies or societies, or in gender as well, which we'll talk more about. Typically, the hunter-gatherer societies, not always, tend to be more egalitarian, and then agricultural and agrarian-based political structures tend to be more hierarchical. And I talked a little bit about that in the last lecture, how sort of the fall into patriarchy came with agriculture, in the agricultural revolution that takes place in ancient Mesopotamia and spreads throughout Eurasia. But of course, indigenous people in the Americas also domesticated plants and animals. And in other parts of the world as well. But that's something that often comes with that is a surplus of food and political states, and then some sort of class-based society that often involves, gender as a form of class and status in a society. So I just also want to acknowledge that the sort of values that we assign about hunter-gatherer societies being primitive or less advanced, those are like problematic value judgments, not really based on anything than some assumptions we have about what makes human life valuable. So a lot of these hunter-gatherer societies, or so-called primitive societies, have very sophisticated cultural and value systems. They are excellent at surviving in a particular natural environment and helping themselves and that natural environment thrive. So in a cultural context where we're dealing with a lot of environmental devastation and climate change and stuff like that, maybe it's important to sort of reconsider sort of the values that we have about dominating the planet, dominating nature, attempting to create permanent structures and permanent alterations to the environment, that those aspects of our civilization that we see as signs of advancement or being civilized or whatever, are maybe overvalued as something to consider. Also, I just put down here on this slide that there were several what by our sort of non-hunter-gatherer values of what is a civilization or whatever that does exist in African history, even before Christianity. And I listed some here, and there's a lot of rich examples of indigenous African cultures and civilizations. And a lot of that isn't taught because of the lingering sort of white supremacist narrative that there was nothing going on in Africa, and that's why it was cool for Europeans to enslave West Africans, and that is absolutely not the case. Not the case. And then, of course, in the Americas, I think it is more common to study maybe the Aztec or the Inca Empire. But another one that's often not taught is Cahokia. So Cahokia was an empire, and those are the dates that it existed. And the heart of it was around like the St. Louis region of North America. And at the time of its peak, Cahokia, the major city of it near St. Louis, had a population probably larger than the population of London at the time. And Cahokia also was so massive that it had trade routes that went up and down the entire Mississippi and across the entire North American continent. What's really devastating is so much of Native American culture and civilization was lost when Europeans came to the Americas because of genocide and violence, but also because of disease. So by the time Europeans got to the St. Louis region, pretty much Cahokia did no longer existed. It could be just extremely high percentages of Native Americans died from diseases that Europeans had that they brought to the Americas that Native Americans did not have immunity for. We're talking hundreds of millions of Native Americans died from these diseases before a lot of these cultures and civilizations actually engaged directly, physically with Europeans. So there's a sad loss. There's a lot of lack of knowledge about that, about some of these cultures and civilizations as well. The circle of right relationships. So these are some values or concepts that you seem to find in a lot of indigenous traditions. There's an emphasis on interconnectedness, that the individual is not very separate from the community. The community is not separate from and that all of our relationships affect each other. That if something goes wrong between two people, it affects the community. That if something goes wrong in the environment, it affects all different species and creatures. That reality is relational and interconnected, and that we are all interdependent on each other. Another common emphasis is on circular time. And this is because these are nature based traditions that observe nature's seasons and cycles, that the year often has some sort of mythic themes that you cycle through year after year, and that time itself is experienced more in alignment with sort of the circular nature of nature's seasons and cycles. Um, okay. Another concept that I sort of talked about with the interconnectedness is this idea of kinship with all of creation, that human beings are related to other animals and that all of life on the planet is related, which is in harmony sort of with modern scientific understandings. Of evolution and natural selection, that all of life is in fact like literally related, and because of this different understanding, human beings are not considered here to dominate and use nature, but are a part of nature. So thinking about the human relationship with non-human nature as one of stewardship, one where humans might have a special place as caretakers of nature, not as dominators of nature, and that humans are part of nature, and that nature isn't here to serve humans that are more important than nature. So, this general understanding means that a lot of these indigenous traditions are less anthropocentric or less human centered than some Western theistic traditions, where humans are not more important than the rest of nature. Humans are not totally separate from the rest of nature, that it's all kin, it's all interconnected and related. And then finally, relationships with spirit, where a lot of indigenous people are concerned about their relationships with the spirits of their ancestors, spirits within nature, mysterious spiritual presences that can be benevolent or malevolent, so good or like tricksters or causing harm. And then there often are supreme beings or a supreme being to reality, and you can have male or female pronouns or masculine or feminine pronouns to refer to this supreme being. Some refer to ultimate reality as grandfather, some as grandmother. Some think of it as impersonal, and then there are all sorts of different feminine, masculine, and like non-binary spiritual presence, spiritual beings and presences as well. So, although everything holistically in the material world and in the natural world is sacred and imbued with spirit, there's often considered a concentration of spirit and spiritual power in certain places or objects. So, there can be places or people that are particularly spiritually potent. There can be ritual objects, so on and so forth. And as we mentioned, some of these indigenous communities and societies are and have been more egalitarian, and others more hierarchical or having power structures within the society. Specifically, some traditions are very patriarchal, or again, you might remember that patriarchal means ruled by men like father figures, or just a male dominated society where women have less power and women are often have to submit to men. And they can be hierarchical in other ways too. There can be class based societies, and these patriarchal patterns are usually observed in agrarian societies rather than hunter gatherer societies. Some other general features of the ones that appear to be more patriarchal is that there are other hierarchies. There are hierarchies among men within the society and class hierarchies. And some of that is observed and enforced through forms of private property, where some people have more access to resources than others, and there are pieces of property that signify power and status within the society. And also sometimes, but not always, that there's a sense of competitiveness and conflict among people within the society for resources and status. So there are societies that are observed to be matriarchal. Matriarchal means, the word would mean ruled by women, like mother figures, but matriarchal societies are actually never observed to be women dominating men systemically the way women are dominated by men in patriarchal societies. So, to my knowledge, there has never been a matriarchal society where men are systemically oppressed and dominated by women. But there are matriarchal societies observed among indigenous communities where the community is very egalitarian and women may have more pronounced say in communal decisions because of their role as caretakers, but not always. Sometimes it is very egalitarian. Other features of matriarchal societies would be less evidence of private property, but more communal ownership of resources, and a society where the value is more on mutuality and relationality and interdependence, fostering a more sort of collaborative communal structure. So these are both observed among indigenous communities. And the sexual relations that play out in these are really interesting too. There are matriarchal societies where the household is run by women and men, and there isn't monogamy where one woman and one man have relationships. There's societies and a lot of indigenous traditions that we'll talk about in a moment. Human sexuality and gender expression is acknowledged to be more complicated than the gender binary, and there isn't as much of a fixation on enforcing heterosexuality or even monogamy, and forcing people to only have one sexual partner. So, in some of these societies, there are also spiritual specialists. So, some people may play pronounced roles in maintaining the tradition. So, you have people that are storytellers. You often have secret societies, some secret societies for men, for women, sacred dancers, priests and priestesses who carry out rituals, um, a shaman or mystical intermediaries. The word shaman comes from the Tungus, a nomadic people of Siberia, and is sometimes translated as one who knows. And of course, like in less hierarchical societies, you have shamans and spiritual specialists. And in the agrarian societies where you have chiefdoms and more hierarchical political states, you would have maybe a priestly class that would often even have priestesses as well. Mediums are spiritual specialists who become possessed by the spirit world and sort of act as an intermediary between a spirit world and the material world. And then medicine people, often people that in the society are given the task of caring for other people's health and welfare. That is considered sort of a spiritual role. A healing role is both spiritual healing and like physical healing sort of intertwined. And then there are some techniques during ceremonies and for spiritual purposes for entering altered states where it is easier for the specialist to communicate with the spirit world, and do sort of and be in their sacred role. And that would include things like drumming, rattling, dancing, and sometimes hallucinogenic drugs. So I want to talk a little bit about how I acknowledge that in a lot of indigenous communities, there are more flexible understandings about human sexuality and gender. So in some indigenous communities, people that in our society would be considered gender nonconforming or have or be part of a sexual minority, so not necessarily heterosexual, would actually be more likely to be revered and given the role of a spiritual specialist or shaman and be valued more. So in some Native American traditions, people that are gender nonconforming are often called two spirits and given higher spiritual status. So before I get into some of that, I think it is an important opportunity here to sort of explain some basics about gender and sexuality and how it relates to LGBTQIA plus concerns. So something that I think a lot of people are confused about is that this community, this LGBTQIA community that is often just given the umbrella term of queer, which I'll talk about, involves two separate aspects of human identity. So there's gender versus sexuality. So it's helpful to distinguish between how your gender is your identity and relationship with yourself. Your sexuality is about who you are attracted to. And these two concepts are not necessarily able to be conflated. So it might help to explain how sex refers to your biological sex, whether you are labeled male or female at birth based on your genitalia. And sex is confusing because many people think you're either male, and have an XY chromosome, or you're female and have two X chromosomes. But actually, a substantial amount of the human population is what's called intersex. And that means that they are neither clear cut male or female. Human beings can be born with XXY chromosomes and also XYY chromosomes as well. And 1 out of 15 human births results in a child that has genitalia that is so sexually ambiguous that you can't really say that they're even more female or male. So biological sex refers to basically your genitalia and what biological sex you're assigned to, typically male or female. Gender is sort of your relationship or your gender identity in relation to that. So whether you identify as a man or a woman, gender queer or gender fluid or non-binary. So that's like a separate thing. And then gender expression is how you express your gender. So you can be born a female, be assigned female at birth, and identify as a woman, but have a very masculine gender expression, but not be a transgender man. You can be born a male, identify as a man, and have a very feminine gender expression, and really not be a transgender woman, and feel that you just have a gender expression that's very different from the one our culture assumes to correspond to your gender identity. So gender expression is very loosey goosey. So all of that is separate from sexual preference. Sexual preference or sexual orientation is who you are attracted to. So you can be a very feminine woman, and be attracted to other women. You can be a very masculine woman with a very masculine gender expression and be attracted to men. And that sort of helps, dividing gender from sexuality sort of helps explain all of the different configurations of gender identity, expression, and sexual preference that we actually see among human beings. And that's why it makes sense that human beings often have a sense about their gender as children when they don't have a sense about necessarily their sexuality. So I just want to explain the acronym up at the top. So L and G stands for lesbian or gay. So women who are attracted to other women, men who are attracted to other men, although the word gay is often used to describe women who are also attracted to other women. Transgender versus cisgender. So cisgender refers to everybody that's not transgender. So that would be if you're assigned male at birth and your gender identity is a man, then you are a cisgender man. Or if your gender identity is female, is assigned female, and you identify as a woman, then you are a cisgender female. Of course, a lot of people do not identify with the biological sex that they've been given. So if you are assigned female and your gender identity is a man, then you are a transgender man. If you are assigned male at birth and feel that you are your gender identity is a woman, then you are a transgender woman. And then there are people that don't feel that their gender identity fits within this binary of man or woman. And that would be people who are non-binary, genderqueer, or gender fluid. The B stands for bisexual, people that are attracted to both men and women. And the word pansexual is sort of sometimes replacing that. And a pansexual is someone that is attracted to other people regardless of their gender identity or gender expression or even biological sex. Queer is an umbrella term to refer to all of these people who are what's considered gender nonconforming, so transgender, or have gender expressions that are very atypical for what society would expect of them. So that'd be gender nonconforming, and sexual minorities, so people who are anything other than basically heterosexual. And queer was a word that was used to insult gender nonconforming and non heterosexual people in the 20th century, and then became, and it originally, the word queer outside of the context of talking about someone's gender or sexuality just means like unusual. And it was like used as an insult, like that's queer, that's weird. And then sort of it was embraced. In the 80s and 90s by gender nonconforming people and bisexual minorities, who embraced the fact that they were out of the norm and that that's actually something to be like celebrated. And that sort of gets at like what the reason why we're talking about this in this lecture is because that is like celebrating gender differences and sexual differences is a part of a lot of indigenous cultures, that suppressing gender nonconforming people and people outside of the compulsory heterosexuality is an artificial thing that is not like natural or a necessary part of human culture and life. That's a constructed, historically constructed thing, and we see that in the ways that a lot of indigenous cultures actually celebrate and hold in high regard people who are gender nonconforming, or who are attracted to our sexual minorities. And then, of course, as I mentioned, intersex are those people that do not fit biologically into the category of male or female. A lot of infertility issues are related to being intersex in ways that a doctor like won't tell you. And it's a really good documentary about intersex individuals is Intersection, which is on, I think you can get it on possibly Canopy and I believe on Amazon as well. And then A in the acronym can stand for asexual, someone that doesn't have sexual attraction towards other people, or sometimes it stands for ally. So people that are allies for and concerned about the well-being and thriving of gender nonconforming people and sexual minorities. So I think this is like basic information that people need to have, and it's really relevant because in these indigenous communities and cultures, this is all like this terminology didn't exist, but you have terms like two spirits. A lot of indigenous cultures and life waves acknowledge more than two genders. That's very common. So it's important to absolutely acknowledge that. Some of their observances involve really community centered rituals and observances that and ceremonies that mark life's transitions, especially the transition from childhood to adulthood, often ones that are specific for men and women, ritual dramas, and enactments of aspects of myths that exist within the culture, and communal pilgrimages to sacred sites as well. Globalization and development. So, this is important to acknowledge for understanding the contemporary, current day relationship of indigenous culture to the globalized capitalist human civilization that we're living in. So, as you will recall, globalization is the expansion and intensification of social relations and consciousness across world time and world space. So, what this looks like, this is from the last chapter, is faster and more accessible communication and transportation, transnational corporations, free trade, urbanization, and unrestrained capitalism. And capitalism, again, is an economic and political system where there's privately owned means of production. So there's private property, and it's a system that is driven by profit. And some that are critical of capitalism point out that profit comes from undercompensating labor for the value that they create. That you pay labor a wage that is a fraction of the value that they are creating for your company or whatever. And by doing that, you make a profit. And so that some argue that a for profit economic system is inherently exploitative. So many scholars point to how the beginning of capitalism and the develop of capitalism, because it is profit driven and because it is based on, and because it's profit driven, is based on the accumulation of wealth and resources, that capitalism and colonialism went hand in hand. That it's not a coincidence that with the development of capitalism, you have colonialism and the institution of chattel slavery. That slavery was a logical conclusion. If you are seeking profit, to have free labor is the best case scenario. So it's not a coincidence that capitalist colonialism sought to enslave people from other lands and take other people's lands and resources through a colonial process. And that the globalized culture that we're living in today is the result of the global capitalist domination, is like typically the argument that's made. And so for a lot of indigenous people, this involved minding their own business and invaders coming in, telling them that they're inferior, destroying their land, just basically through violence and coercion, taking the resources of that land. And then the people, if they didn't die from disease or deliberately murderous genocidal practices like we see among the Spanish and the Caribbean in particular, then what happens is the conquered or colonized people don't have access to their land and natural resources anymore, and instead have, if they want to survive, have to work for their colonizers as slaves or as wage slaves, where they have to work for access back to the food and resources they need to survive, that are now just sort of taken through a process called enclosure by capitalist colonizers. And globally, what all this looks like today is the distinction between the developed world, the developing world, and the undeveloped world, which is often language that has been used to describe this. Is the developed world that is at a more advanced capitalist stage is referred to as the first world. So for the first world would be like North America and Europe. And what's interesting is the conditions for laborers in the first world in earlier stages of capitalism looked like wage slavery, was very brutal. You read a Charles Dickens novel and you learn about industrialization in Europe and the United States, and working people had a very brutal time. It was like sweatshops that we would call today. The developing world, our second world, refers to countries that are sort of in the transition of this process. And then the undeveloped world would be the world that's living in sort of earlier stages of capitalist development, where the working conditions are very brutal and the wages are very brutal. And there's often malnutrition and hunger and starvation, poor access to education and healthcare, and that would be referred to as the third world. And the general division for this is that you often see that the first world or the developed world is referred to as the global north because it is North America and Europe, mainly in the undeveloped world, or the third world, is the global south, so Africa and South America. And it gets more complicated when we look at Asia, but that's a general pattern that's been observed. And then there's another way of analyzing this global process called world systems analysis, where the first world is seen as the core, the second world or the developing world, the semi-periphery, and then the third world, the periphery. So it explains how people that are indigenous or more recently sort of colonized are often more likely to be in the periphery, where living conditions under global capitalism are extremely brutal. And it's to the benefit of the first world. So in the United States, we have access to a lot of very cheap goods because those goods are created through very poorly compensated, cruel labor practices in the global South. So you can't understand the relationship of indigenous people to our globalized civilization without acknowledging the history of colonialism and sort of the way that these nature-based traditions were disrupted by a capitalist um, system and a Christian religious system that accompanied it that did not value nature and thought of humans as separate from nature, and sort of justified having a very brutal relationship to nature and other people that were considered not human and instead part of nature. So this is all an interconnected picture. Um, so, in the present and future, understanding some basics of that context. So, I'm going to skip to the quote from the textbook. Some indigenous peoples feel that their traditional sacred ways are not only valid, but actually essential for the future of the world. They see these understandings as antidotes to mechanistic, dehumanizing, and environmentally destructive ways of life. So, as a global society, as we are reaching sort of an environmental crisis of climate change, and um, the many indigenous people and practices and traditions that were about living in harmony with nature might provide some insight for healing human relationships with nature and creating a more sustainable civilization. There has been claims that a lot of people are co-opting indigenous traditions, for example, by like a New Age movement in the United States and Europe, where you see white people wearing Native American headdresses at music festivals and um, taking like other elements of Native cultures in non that were supposed to be sacred in non-sacred contexts. And this could be problematic examples of cultural misappropriation. What's also interesting is among Europeans, the rise of interest in neo paganism, Wicca, and witchcraft. So, a lot of Europeans are, especially women, are looking at sort of the history of how their people were also forcibly Christianized and how their most ancient practices were indigenous European nature based pagan practices. And that Christianity demonized those earlier pagan nature based traditions by deeming them witchcraft and demonizing witchcraft and associating witchcraft with devil worship or Satanism. And we see the witch hunts throughout Europe. And witch hunts were also conducted in the so called New World and among colonized people too, as a movement or a consolidation between the budding capitalist colonizer and their religion, sort of justifying what they were doing to other people and to dominate a new region. Part of it was to say that their religion was inferior and even demonic. So that's where this concept of witchcraft and the association of witchcraft with devil worship comes from, is that it's part of the narrative to justify forcibly Christianizing people, forcibly stamping out their earlier traditions. And there's often a lot of extreme misogyny or hatred of women involved in that process. So a lot of people today are reclaiming witchcraft, or reclaiming as a feminist consciousness thing, as an anti-patriarchal, as a wanting to heal your relationship with nature. That is a common thing. Wicca is sort of a new age version of that where people are embracing witchcraft and nature-based traditions not as like Satan worship or devil worship, but as going back to the original nature-based traditions, of their people. So that's an important acknowledgement as well. What's interesting is you can see this. So European pagan traditions often had a visual representation of the goddess as a moon goddess and the god as a sun, but sometimes there was a god of nature, Pan, who was pictured as having like ram's horns or deer horns. And as Christians from the Roman Empire came to Christianize Europeans, they started depicting Satan or the devil as having horns. It's you can see like imagery of the devil and Satan mirrored whatever understanding of the nature-based religion that was being conquered was exhibiting. So that's where a lot of that imagery comes from. But most people that are into paganism and witchcraft do not actually believe in the devil or Satan. So, some questions. How has globalization affected Indigenous peoples? What are some differences between matriarchal and patriarchal societies? Why this is a very important, these last two questions are ones that you really might want to focus on as you consider what to write about for your discussion post. Why might Indigenous sacred ways be better described as life ways than religions? And explain the symbolic importance of the circle for many Indigenous sacred ways. As always, please feel free to reach out for me if you would like more information about anything that I covered in this lecture, or any concerns that you have.